The true triumph was psychological. Thousands of young men were taught to override human instinct to trust invisible, geometry over reflex, to believe in the unseen arc of a bullet curving through air they could not feel. In that, the gunnery schools did more than produce warriors. They produced thinkers of motion and consequence, men who understood that survival in modern war depended on understanding forces far larger than themselves. Instructors would often recall the looks on recruits' faces during the first week. Farm boys from Iowa, machinists from Ohio, mechanics from Detroit, men who had never been more than a few feet off the ground now listening. As officers explained that their lives would depend on trigonometry and intuition welded into one. The desert wind scraped across the barracks at night, rattling tin roofs while the sound of distant gunfire echoed from the ranges. Even the stars above seemed to shimmer, like tracer rounds frozen in time. By spring 1944, the desert school had become a living organism, engines starting before dawn, trucks loaded with ammunition rolling toward the practice ranges, the clatter of .50 caliber, machine guns blending with the roar of AT-6 trainers overhead. At dusk, the air smelled of burnt powder and dust. Beneath the flagpole, instructors gathered around chalkboards illuminated by lantern light, revising equations, angles, and tactics learned from the day's lessons. Every improvement, every recalculated deflection, meant another bomber might survive its next mission. In the end, position firing became more than a tactical innovation. It was a metaphor for the entire American war effort, a vast experiment in learning faster than the enemy could adapt. Each discovery born from trial and error, from physics and human courage intertwined. It wasn't heroism in the traditional sense, no glorious charges or spontaneous acts of valor. It was method, discipline, the quiet victory of understanding over instinct. And yet, even as the war drew to a close, many of those gunners would confess that in combat, when the enemy filled their sights, instinct still screamed to aim straight at him. They would hesitate, then remember Nevada. Remember the diagrams, the pendulum swinging under Sergeant Hayes's hand. Remember the endless days shooting. From moving trucks and towers under a sky that seemed to stretch forever, they would adjust their aim, fire where no man could see the target, and watch the laws of motion write survival in tracer fire. The desert that once echoed. With the staccato rhythm of Browning, machine guns fell silent after 1945. The barracks decayed. The ranges were reclaimed by sand and sagebrush. But for those who trained there, the lessons never left. Some became engineers, pilots, teachers. Some never made it home, yet all carried within them a simple, immutable truth that understanding could be as powerful a weapon as instinct. And sometimes, to strike the enemy, you must first aim at the impossible. The war moved faster than any training manual could keep up with. By mid-1944, the skies over Europe had become laboratories of death and learning. Every mission over France, every raid into Germany, returned with lessons written in bullet holes and burnt metal. The men who had once practiced in the Nevada sun were now writing new equations in the frozen air above. Berlin in the waist of a B-17 named Iron Faith. Sergeant William Red Porter gripped the handles of his .50 caliber twin mounts. Below him, 1,000 feet of cloud shimmered in the winter sun. The intercom crackled. Bandits? 3 o'clock high. He didn't look at the enemy, he looked ahead of them. His mind replayed Sergeant Hayes's voice from the desert. Don't aim at what you see. Aim at where he'll be when your bullet gets there. He swung the guns, past the approaching Messerschmitts, firing into empty air. A heartbeat later, tracers met aluminum, and the first German fighter disintegrated into fire. That moment, that invisible arc, was the triumph of the desert's unseen classroom. But the price was brutal. Every successful calculation carried another man's failure. For every bomber that made it home, another vanished into cloud and silence. Position firing had turned survival into mathematics, yet war remained mercilessly human. The gunners knew this. Between missions, they stared at bullet holes, patched with silver tape, and counted the names, scratched off the crew list. At the training ranges, new recruits kept coming, boys no older than 19. They studied film reels from combat cameras, tracing enemy flight paths with chalk on projection screens. The airmen from Nevada now returned as instructors, their lessons tempered by loss. Remember, they told the newcomers, the desert wasn't about hitting a target, it was about staying alive long enough to find one. By 1945, the program had evolved again. Aerial gunnery moved from instinct and feel to machines and prediction analog. Computers calculating lead, radar-assisted turrets locking onto moving dots of light. Yet the heart of it all remained. The same geometry drawn in sand. With a boot heel back in 1942, when the war finally ended, the instructors disbanded quietly. There were no parades for the men who taught mathematics with gunfire. The ranges emptied, the chalkboards erased. But in the vast archives of film and training notes, a simple philosophy endured that knowledge. Precision and patience could turn fear into focus, chaos into calculation. Decades later, when the jet age replaced propellers and computers replaced slide rules, veterans of the gunnery schools would still recall the desert. They remembered how the sun melted the horizon, how tracer fire curved across the sky like drawn lines in an invisible book of physics. They spoke not of victory, but of comprehension, the strange, serene understanding that war, for all its fury, could be measured in seconds, angles, and courage. The last of them. The war had ended, but its methods lingered buried within manuals, test ranges, and the memories of those who had survived by mathematics. When peace returned, so too did the illusion that instinct alone could guide the future. Yet for a generation of engineers, scientists, and pilots who had stared down death through a gun sight, the lessons of the desert refused to fade. In 1946, at Wright Field in Ohio, a new kind of classroom began to take shape, but for missiles. They had traded sand for concrete, but the equations were the same. Deflection, velocity, time of flight, the invisible geometry of survival reborn for a new kind of war. Captain Porter, once the waist gunner of Iron Faith, now worked as a test observer. He watched as engineers adapted the lessons of position firing into the first radar-guided gun turrets and computer-controlled sights. "We used to lead with instinct," he told a young technician. "Now we lead with algorithms." His words carried both pride and unease, a soldier's awe before the machine that had learned to think faster than man. As the Cold War dawned, aerial combat transformed again. The jet age compressed time, and space dogfights were decided in seconds, at speeds unthinkable in 1943. Yet in every radar, screen, and targeting computer, the ghost of the desert training lived on. When a Sabre pilot in Korea or a Phantom crew over Vietnam fired at an enemy they could not see, their shots followed the same logic once taught under the Nevada sun, but something essential had changed. In the 1940s, the geometry of survival, mankind had forgotten the cost that gave it meaning. At the old desert range, wind swept across broken concrete and rusted bullet casings half buried in sand. A historical marker, erected by a local veterans group in 1972, read simply, "On clear nights, starlight still, glints off fragments of spent shells, scattered among the sagebrush. The silence is immense, almost reverent. It's said that if you stand there long enough, you can still hear echoes, the rhythmic stutter of Brownings, the barked commands of instructors, the hum of a truck bouncing across the range, ghosts of motion frozen in time, their geometry still perfect, their lessons still alive. The men who once fired from those trucks and towers are nearly all gone now. But the mathematics, they mastered the understanding that life and death could hinge on the difference between instinct and calculation lives on in every pilot's training simulator, every missile guidance system, every machine that anticipates motion before it happens. The desert, in its quiet way, became one of the birthplaces of modern warfare, not through destruction, but through understanding. What began as a desperate experiment to keep young men alive became the foundation of a new military philosophy. That knowledge itself was a weapon, and so the story closes where it began, under a vast, empty sky, where geometry met courage, and the invisible lines of motion drawn decades. The 21st century arrived not with thunder, but with silence. Battles once fought in roaring skies now unfolded from command, centers wars guided by operators, staring at screens thousands of miles from the front. Yet behind every satellite feed, every crosshair flickering on a monitor, lay a lineage older than radar or jet engines. The legacy of the gunnery schools, the belief that understanding motion, prediction, and consequence could outthink chaos had simply evolved. In Nevada once again, The desert had returned to the center of war's education, not as a firing range, but as a digital battle space. Creech Air Force, based just miles from the ruins of the old WWI training fields, now trained drone pilots. Their weapons no longer spat tracer fire, but invisible bursts of precision guided by algorithms. And yet their instructors echoed lessons. Born 80 years earlier, was the same phrase shouted by Sergeant Hayes. Across the sand in 1942, now spoken to a new generation through headsets and fiber optics. The geometry remained unchanged. Only the distance between the trigger and the consequence had grown. In modern flight simulators, young airmen trace moving shapes across digital skies, just as their grandfathers once traced enemy silhouettes on film reels. The principles of deflection, speed, and timing have been reborn in code and light. But the questions they raise about human judgment, accountability, and the nature of killing from afar remain as heavy as ever. Some veterans of the old aerial gunnery program, before they passed, were shown drone footage strikes from the very desert where they had once fired 50 caliber rounds into the horizon. Many fell silent. Others simply nodded. Different tools, one said. Same geometry. The lineage of position firing became the DNA of modern warfare. Predictive targeting, algorithmic anticipation, artificial intelligence trained to see motion before it happens. What once required a gunner's instinct and a chalkboard of equations could now be done in microseconds by a circuit. Yet the human element, that fragile, essential judgment born from fear and experience, still determines when to act and when to hold fire. In the Air Force archives, film reels from 1943 still flicker desert footage of trainees firing from trucks, dust clouds rising beneath tracer fire. Next to them, modern digital logs record drone sorties with perfect telemetry. Two eras separated by technology, united by philosophy, both built on the same question. Can understanding replace instinct without losing humanity? Historians often say the gunnery schools were where America learned to think like a machine without becoming one. That lesson remains, the quiet heartbeat beneath every precision strike and every command decision made from afar. For even now, every missile that finds its mark is a distant echo of a bullet fired across Nevada's horizon in 1942. At sunset, the desert looks unchanged. The wind sweeps across forgotten ranges. In the digital age, the same dilemma continues. Algorithms now make decisions, once reserved for men with trembling hands and sweat on their foreheads. The cold precision of machines carries the same burden, only now the human element stands one step further back. But somewhere in that chain of command, someone still feels the weight of the trigger. Someone still remembers the lesson of the desert. The geometry of survival has become the geometry of consequence. It reminds us that knowledge is never neutral, that understanding how to predict motion is also understanding how to change the course of history. And so, the story ends not with the sound of gunfire, but with silence, the same silence that fell over Nevada when the last shot echoed across the sand. In that stillness lies everything the gunnery schools ever meant. The fusion of intellect and instinct, the courage to calculate, and the haunting realization that wisdom and war are forever intertwined. The desert remains, unchanged and eternal. But somewhere beneath the dunes and wind, the old lessons sleep not as echoes of violence, but as fragments of understanding. The men are gone. The equations endure, because in the end, war is not just about who aims faster, but who understands first. In the end, every weapon, every system, every theory of war returns to one simple question. What does understanding cost? The men who trained in the desert never sought glory. They sought survival, to master fear through comprehension, to turn chaos into order. But long after the last shot was fired, they discovered that understanding war does not end it. It simply reveals how fragile the line between reason and ruin truly is. By the late 20th century, the men who once learned to lead the target had grown old. Some taught physics, others worked in factories, and a few returned to the quiet emptiness of Nevada, drawn back to the place where they had first learned the geometry of life and death. The firing towers were gone, the trucks rusted to dust. Yet as they stood among the sagebrush, they could still see its tracer lines etched in memory, frozen against the twilight sky. For them, the desert was sacred ground, not because of the war it prepared them for, but because of what it revealed. about human beings that survival depends not on hatred or luck, but on learning, on the ability to think clearly when the world falls apart. That was the true legacy of the gunnery schools. Not just training, but transformation psychologists later studied those men and discovered something unique. They described it as anticipatory cognition, the capacity to predict motion, risk and consequence faster than emotion can intervene. It was both gift and curse. The same clarity that once kept them alive now made ordinary life feel slower, duller, uncertain. One veteran confessed, "After the war, I couldn't stop calculating. Every car, every bird, every shadow, my mind saw trajectories." It wasn't trauma in the traditional sense. It was the lingering echo of control, the belief that if you understood enough, you could stay one step ahead of fate. But life, unlike combat, refuses to follow equations. And so many spent their later years learning to forget what the desert had taught them, yet even as their memories faded, the meaning remained. What began as a desperate wartime experiment had become a lesson for generations. That intellect without empathy is dangerous. An instinct without understanding is blind. The perfect balance between the two, that was the human equation. In modern times, as machines calculate faster than thought, the same question echoes again. Can we preserve that balance? Can we remain human in a world that rewards precision but forgets compassion? The men of the desert would have understood this tension. They lived it every time they aimed not to kill, but to survive. At the edge of the old gunnery range, where wind sweeps over the sand, a single monument stands. The inscription reads, "Here, men learned to think under fire and in doing so, became something more than soldiers." It is quiet there now, only the sound of wind and distance. But if you close your eyes, you can still imagine the faint rhythm of the Brownings, the shouted commands, the laughter of boys who learned the impossible, to outthink fear itself. They left behind no empire, no monuments of conquest, and only equations, memories, and the knowledge that even in war, understanding can be an act of humanity, because when the last gun fell silent, what endured wasn't the weapon. It was the mind that learned to aim not at the enemy, but at truth. War has always been measured in machines, numbers, and maps, but beneath every calculation lies a heartbeat. The final legacy of the gunnery schools was never written in manuals or weapon systems. It lived in the men who learned that knowledge could both save and burden the soul. For them, survival was not just a matter of accuracy, it was a confrontation with what precision costs. Decades after the war, when the desert ranges were quiet and the men who once fired across them had grown old, interviews captured a different kind of memory. They spoke not of victory or glory, but of learning, of the strange transformation that turned fear into calculation, hesitation into prediction. One veteran, his hands trembling from age, described it simply. "They taught us how to survive, but they also taught us how to think too much about what that meant." For every gunner who learned the perfect deflection angle, there came a night when that same geometry replayed. In dreams, the instant when knowledge and consequence became one, the mathematics that saved them also haunted them, because it revealed that death could be solved like a problem on a board. And once you understood that, you could never unlearn it. In the years that followed, many of those men became teachers, engineers, fathers' men who looked at the world differently. They saw motion everywhere, a baseball's arc, a car's turn, a bird crossing the sky. They saw trajectories, invisible predictions shaping everything that moved. The war had changed how they saw reality. Itself, psychologists, studying combat veterans later, called it predictive trauma, the inability to stop calculating outcomes even in peace. The gunnery schools had trained an entire generation to see danger before it appeared, to live in the split second before impact. It kept them alive in war. It made peace strangely unbearable. Yet amid all the pain and memory, there was also pride not in destruction, but in understanding. Those who survived often said that the desert taught them the purest truth they ever knew, that human life, like flight, depended on balance between instinct and intellect, courage and caution, emotion and reason. The geometry of survival was also the geometry of being human. In one of the last recorded interviews, an aging instructor stood beside the remains of the old training range. The wind lifted sand across the cracked concrete pads. He looked toward the horizon, where tracer fire once drew, lines of light through the dusk. "We weren't Just training gunners, he said softly. We were teaching men to think under fear. That's the real secret. Not how to shoot, how to stay. Human when everything in you wants to stop being one. That was the unspoken equation, the one never written on the chalkboards. For every variable of speed and angle, there was another: conscience, memory, empathy. The balance between the mechanical and the moral. Between the eye and the heart.